More on how the world is responding to the Afghanistan situation. We're joined by Ben Oquist, the Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Welcome in, Ben. How are you today?
Good morning, Adrian. I'm well.
So let's talk about perhaps how the world is responding. The US, as we've just touched on, is leading the way in some ways, as they should. But how have you seen this play out, particularly with the US response and now Australia?
Well, in a way, what we're witnessing is a monumental policy and intelligence failure globally. And the world's shifting to realise that we now have a full-scale humanitarian crisis, and it requires a full-scale humanitarian response. And 20 years of trying to make something of Afghanistan with a military solution, when policymakers in the US and in Australia haven't prioritised the humanitarian solution, has led to this outcome. And now governments are scrambling to put in place an effective humanitarian response. Canada and the United Kingdom have announced a big increase in refugee quota or humanitarian intake. And now the pressure, of course, is on Australia to do the same in three ways. We've got a duty of care, of course, Australia does to those Afghanis who helped Australian forces. We have to do better in getting them out. Then there's the Afghans in Australia now who Prime Minister was under some pressure yesterday to give them permanent protection because, after all, they're only here on temporary protection visas. And while they've been assured they won't be sent back anytime soon, they can't really get on with their lives without a permanent protection visa. And finally, Australia will come under pressure to lift its humanitarian intake, just as Bob Hawke did after Tiananmen Square, just as John Howard did in relation to Kosovo, just as Tony Abbott did in relation to Syria. The Prime Minister will come under pressure to increase that humanitarian intake. There is Afghanis fleeing Afghanistan. Yes, Australia needs to get in there and get those who have assisted Australian presence there in the past, but also those Afghanis that are fleeing the country will need new homes, and Australia, as part of a global response, will be under pressure to increase that humanitarian intake.
So a lot of the concern, obviously, at the moment is for women and children in particular, in terms of how significant their rights will change or could change. The Taliban have come out through their spokesperson and said that they won't change significantly. Many people will doubt that, of course. How concerned are you for the people in Afghanistan, particularly the women right now?
Yeah, it is a terrible time for Afghanistan and its population, and many in Australia have got family members there and are rightly terrified. And it underscores that the prioritising the military response in Afghanistan over all these years hasn't worked. It needed to be a society-wide intervention, needed to be building up civil society, but all that's failed and has left many in Afghanistan, women and children in particular, in a really vulnerable situation now. And that's why the world and Australia has a particular responsibility to step up a much bigger humanitarian response. A full-scale humanitarian crisis requires a full-scale humanitarian response. And we haven't seen that from Australia yet. And ensuring that Afghans in Australia have permanent protection, ensuring that those in particular we have a duty of care to are brought to Australia as swiftly as possible, and then increasing the humanitarian intake are the things that Australia can best do immediately to look after as many of those in Afghanistan as we can, notwithstanding, of course, that there'll be many that won't be helped by Australia, but as part of a global response, we can play our part.
In terms of what Prime Minister Scott Morrison said yesterday, because you've just touched on there, this is what we need to do, it needs to be a full-scale humanitarian effort. If he hasn't committed to that immediately in many ways, it makes you think that perhaps he won't at all. What did you take of his comments yesterday?
Well, unfortunately, Australia hasn't had an independent policy in relation to Afghanistan. We're an ally of the United States, but too often we have simply followed United States policy in relation to Afghanistan, and charting our own independent policy still can be an ally of the United States, but recognising that there's been massive overreach by the US. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in Iraq, and it happened in Afghanistan, has led to this disaster. And Australia needs to think more clear-headedly about foreign policy engagements. Afghanistan is a different country, has a different way of governing, has a tribal system, but Australia could have done more in helping build up its civil society. Recognising those policy failures so we can learn from the future is not something we're currently seeing from the Australian government. If it is a massive policy failure from the Biden administration, it's a massive policy failure from Australia. But now the priority has to be a humanitarian response, and we haven't yet seen that from the Australian government. Yes, there's some belated effort to get some Afghanistan people out who have assisted Australians' operations there, but that's come, as many people have said, too late, and it's too little. We closed our embassy too early. Now we're playing catch up. But there will be a bigger humanitarian crisis beyond those who assisted Australia, and Australia's got to play its part there. Already we're seeing moves from the UK and Canada to take in more refugees, and that's the sort of response that Australia is going to have to step up now, like happened in relation to Syria under Tony Abbott, like happened with Bob Hawke in relation to China after Tiananmen Square, and that's the leadership I think that Scott Morrison will be under some pressure to show now.
Ben, just a brief one to finish on President Joe Biden. What would you say in the way that they've managed this situation? How have they played this out, and is this a complete failure, would you say?
Well, it's a failure not just in the short term. You've got to look over the whole 20 years of US policy in relation to Afghanistan. They went into Afghanistan in the first place to hunt down bin Laden and stamp out terrorism. And while that can be a worthwhile objective, the strategy wasn't there to back it up. And in fact, they took their eye off the ball and went to Iraq for nefarious reasons. And that allowed the original intent of the strategy in Afghanistan not to work. But overall, you can't fight terrorism with solely a military response. It's a societal problem, it's a political problem, it's a law and order issue, and it needed to be tackled in that sense rather than just through the military. And that's the policy failure as much as the short-term intelligence failure not to realise how quickly it would take over.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.